I didn't find out my wife was cheating because of some dramatic text message or because somebody slipped up and confessed. Honestly, if it wasn't for my kids, I might have gone years without knowing anything at all. Looking back now, that's probably the part that still sticks with me the most. Kids notice everything. They don't always understand what they're seeing, but they notice. And sometimes they tell you the truth without even realizing it. This all started back in late 2019. At the time, my wife Lauren and I had been married for almost 11 years. We lived in a quiet town outside Columbus, Ohio, nothing fancy. Just one of those neighborhoods where everybody waved at each other while mowing their lawns and where every kid rode the same bikes until the tires practically fell off. We had two children, Ethan and Abby, 7 and 5 years old. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. Inside, well, that's where things get complicated. Lauren worked part-time at a boutique pharmacy across town. Her schedule wasn't demanding, usually 3 or 4 days a week. The rest of the time she was supposedly spending time with the kids, helping around the house, visiting family. At least that's what I thought. The first little crack appeared one evening during dinner. Abby was talking about her day while shoving macaroni into her mouth. "Dad, Grandpa let me feed the horses again." I looked up. "Horses, yeah. My father-in-law didn't own horses." Lauren answered quickly. "Oh, she means the neighbor's horses." Something about the speed of her answer caught my attention, not enough to start a fight, just enough to make me notice. A few days later, Ethan mentioned spending another afternoon at Lauren's parents' place. Then Abby mentioned it. Then Ethan mentioned it again. Pretty soon I realized something weird. My in-laws lived nearly 2 hours away. Yet according to the kids, they were apparently visiting multiple times every week. That didn't make sense. One Saturday morning while Lauren was in the shower, I stood in the kitchen drinking coffee and trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they really were visiting more often. Maybe I was overthinking things, but once doubt gets into your head, it starts connecting dots whether you want it to or not. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention, nothing obvious. No secret phone calls, no suspicious text messages, no disappearing overnight, just little things, tiny inconsistencies. Lauren would say she spent the afternoon with her mother, but she'd come home emotionally exhausted in a way that didn't fit. Sometimes she'd seem unusually happy, other times she'd be distracted for hours. Then there was the mileage. That was what really bothered me. One afternoon, I borrowed her SUV to pick up mulch for our flower beds. When I got back, I noticed the odometer. I don't know why, just one of those random moments. But after that, I started checking occasionally. And the numbers didn't add up, not even close. Every week there seemed to be hundreds of extra miles showing up. Way more than her work schedule could explain, way more than family visits could explain. The old police instincts I'd spent years trying to leave behind suddenly woke back up. I started keeping notes, dates, mileage, times, patterns. Nothing obsessive, just enough to satisfy my own curiosity. At least that's what I told myself. Then came the moment everything changed. One afternoon I was paying bills in our home office. Lauren had been using the computer earlier that day. Next to the keyboard was a yellow sticky note just sitting there like it had been waiting for me. At first I wasn't even paying attention, then I looked closer. Written on that note was a password, her Gmail password. I remember staring at it for several seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could actually hear it, because deep down I knew I was standing at a crossroads. If I ignored it, life could continue exactly as it was. If I looked, there would be no going back. I wish I could tell you I resisted. I didn't. The second I logged in, my stomach dropped. There weren't hundreds of emails. There didn't need to be. Only a handful told me everything. Messages between Lauren and her longtime friend Melissa. Conversations that stretched back months. Conversations about another man, an old boyfriend from high school named Travis. At first I thought maybe I was misunderstanding something. Maybe it was emotional cheating, maybe old memories, maybe harmless flirting. Then I kept reading. Lunch dates, hotel receipts, private jokes, detailed descriptions of meetings. There was no room for interpretation. My wife was having an affair. And not just an affair, a long-term affair. The kind that requires planning, lying, practice. The kind where someone looks you in the eye every day and tells the same lie so many times they almost start believing it themselves. I sat there for nearly an hour, not angry, not yet, mostly numb. The worst part wasn't even discovering Travis. It was reading how casually they talked about me, like I was some obstacle, some inconvenience. Some clueless guy who existed only to pay bills and keep the lights on. At one point, Melissa joked that I was too predictable to ever notice. Lauren replied with a laughing emoji. That one hurt more than anything else, not the affair, not the lies. That I printed every email, every attachment, every receipt. Then I locked everything inside a file cabinet in the garage. That night, Lauren sat across from me eating takeout while talking about a TV show. I nodded at all the right moments. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. Inside, something had already changed, because now I knew, and once you know something like that, you can never unknow it. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a retired detective named Frank Mercer. We used to work together before I left law enforcement. Frank listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, there was silence. Then he sighed, "You already know what I'm gonna say." "Yeah, you need evidence." I stared out the window at my kids playing basketball in the driveway. "I know." Frank gave me the number of a private investigator he'd trusted for years, a guy named Nolan Reeves. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Nolan in a small office above a tire shop, handing him copies of the emails and explaining what little I knew. When I finished, Nolan leaned back in his chair. "You want the truth?" I nodded. He folded his hands. "Careful what you wish for. Most people think they want answers. What they really want is reassurance." For a second, I almost walked away. Maybe ignorance would have been easier. Maybe some doors should stay closed. But then I thought about Ethan. I thought about Abby. I thought about every lie I'd already uncovered. No, I said quietly. I want the truth. And that's exactly what Nolan went looking for. What he found over the next 3 weeks would blow this entire situation wide open and reveal that Travis wasn't nearly as untouchable as he thought he was. For the first few days after hiring Nolan, nothing happened. At least that's what it felt like. Every morning I'd wake up next to Lauren, help get the kids ready for school, drink coffee at the kitchen counter, head to work, come home, eat dinner, and pretend everything was normal. That was probably the hardest part, not the betrayal, not the evidence, the acting. When someone lies to you long enough, eventually you start lying too. I lied every time I smiled, every time I asked how her day was, every time I kissed her forehead before leaving for work. And the whole time I was waiting for a phone call that I knew was coming. 3 weeks later, it finally did. I was sitting in my truck outside a hardware store when Nolan called. His voice sounded different, more serious, less professional. Got a minute? He asked, my stomach tight. Yeah. You'll want to sit down. That's never a sentence that leads anywhere good. I pulled into an empty parking spot and waited. Nolan didn't waste time. He started laying out dates, locations, photographs, receipts, surveillance logs. Every single thing I'd suspected was true. Lauren wasn't spending afternoons with her parents. She wasn't running errands. She wasn't working extra shifts. 2 or 3 times every week she'd drop the kids off with her parents, drive 45 minutes south, meet Travis for lunch, and then spend several hours with him before returning to pick the kids up. The routine was so consistent it practically ran on a schedule. Monday afternoons, Thursday afternoons, some weekends, same restaurants, same motel, same route, same lies. I sat there listening while staring through my windshield. People were walking in and out of the hardware store carrying paint cans and bags of mulch, normal people living normal lives. Meanwhile, mine felt like it was being dismantled piece by piece. When Nolan finished, he said something unexpected. There's more. I closed my eyes. Of course there was. There always is. Nolan gave a dry laugh. That's what I figured. Then he explained why he had kept digging. Something about Travis hadn't sat right with him. The guy was too comfortable. Too reckless. Most people having affairs make mistakes because they're nervous. Travis acted like he had nothing to lose. Turns out there was a reason. His name wasn't actually the biggest surprise. His family was. Travis wasn't some bachelor chasing old memories. He was married, 3 kids, big house, country club membership, the whole package. Even more interesting, he worked as chief operations officer for a manufacturing company owned by his father-in-law. And according to Nolan, that father-in-law wasn't just wealthy. He practically owned half the county. The more Nolan dug, the clearer the picture became. Travis had spent years building a reputation as the perfect family man, church volunteer, youth baseball coach, local charity board member, the kind of guy who smiled for every community photo, the kind of guy people trusted, the kind of guy who believed consequences only happened to other people. When Nolan finished his report, he slid a thick folder across the table during our next meeting. I remember staring at it. Months of evidence, photographs, dates, financial records, hotel visits, witness statements, enough documentation to sink a battleship. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt exhausted. Because now came the part nobody talks about. Making a decision, finding out the truth is one thing, deciding what to do with it is something else entirely. For several days, I wrestled with it. I thought about confronting Lauren. I imagined dramatic arguments, tears, confessions, maybe apologies, but every version ended the same way: more lies, more excuses, more manipulation, and honestly, I wasn't interested anymore. I didn't want explanations, I wanted reality, so I hired a divorce attorney. Her name was Rebecca Collins, sharpest lawyer I'd ever met. She spent about 20 minutes reviewing Nolan's evidence before looking up. Well, she said, this is unfortunately very thorough. That's good, right? For us, absolutely, I nodded. Then she asked a question I hadn't expected. What outcome do you want? I thought about that for a long moment. Revenge would have been the easy answer, but it wasn't the truth. I want stability for my kids, Rebecca smiled slightly. Good answer. Over the next month, we quietly prepared everything: financial records, custody proposals, property documents, retirement accounts. Every detail. Lauren had no idea. Meanwhile, Nolan continued gathering information on Travis, not because we needed it, because I wanted to understand exactly who I'd been dealing with. What I learned was fascinating. The image Travis projected and the man he actually was couldn't have been more different. Behind closed doors, he treated people like disposable tools. Former employees hated him. Business partners tolerated him. Several friendships had quietly evaporated over the years. And somehow he'd always managed to avoid accountability. Until now, the final piece arrived unexpectedly. One evening, Nolan called. You should probably hear this. What happened? I spoke with someone close to Travis's wife. I waited. Apparently, Travis's wife, Emily, had suspected something for months. Nothing concrete, just instincts, the late meetings, the sudden schedule changes, the emotional distance. Sound familiar? It did, more than I wanted to admit. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt sorry for someone besides myself. Because somewhere out there was another person living the same confusion I'd been living. Another parent trying to make sense of small inconsistencies. Another spouse slowly being made to feel crazy. That realization changed everything. This stopped being about revenge. It became about truth, not just for me, for her too. Rebecca finalized the divorce filing 2 weeks later. The timing was intentional. Precise, surgical. Lauren would be served at work, public enough to prevent a dramatic scene at home, professional enough to avoid involving the kids. At the exact same time, Emily would receive copies of Nolan's investigation, every photograph, every timeline, every piece of evidence. Nobody would be ambushed. Nobody would be manipulated. Everyone would get the same truth on the same day. The night before everything happened, I barely slept, not because I doubted the decision. Because I knew life was about to split into two chapters, before and after. Around 3 in the morning, I walked downstairs and sat alone in the living room. The house was silent. Family photos covered the walls, vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings, little snapshots of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I kept staring at one picture from a beach trip years earlier. Lauren was laughing. The kids were building a sandcastle. I looked happy. Maybe I was. Maybe that version of us had been real once. That's the thing people don't tell you. Relationships don't usually collapse overnight. Most of the time they erode slowly. 1,000 tiny choices, 1,000 small betrayals, until eventually the structure gives way. Around sunrise, I finally stood up and went upstairs. Lauren was still asleep. For a moment, I just stood there looking at her, not with anger, not with hatred, just sadness. Because despite everything, this was someone I'd once planned to grow old with. Someone I'd trusted with my entire future, and now we were strangers sharing a house. The next morning unfolded with almost eerie calm. The kids left for school, I left for work. Lauren left for the pharmacy, and then at exactly 10:07 a.m. the first domino fell. Rebecca's process server walked into Lauren's workplace and handed her an envelope. At almost the same moment, another courier arrived at Emily's house carrying a package that would completely change her understanding of the previous year. For nearly 2 hours I heard nothing. Then my phone exploded, missed calls, text messages, voicemails, Lauren over and over. The first voicemail was confusion, the second was panic, the third was anger. By the seventh message she was crying. I didn't answer, not yet. Because at that exact moment, nearly 40 miles away, another conversation was taking place. And unlike Lauren's reaction, Emily's response would trigger a chain of events that neither Travis nor Lauren saw coming. By sunset, careers would be in danger, families would be imploding, and the carefully constructed life Travis had spent years protecting would begin collapsing faster than anyone thought possible. By the time the sun started setting that evening, I finally answered Lauren's call. I didn't do it because I was ready. I did it because eventually reality catches up with everyone. The second I picked up, all I heard was breathing, then her voice. What is this? Not hello, not how are you, just those three words. I leaned back in my office chair and stared out the window. You know exactly what it is. The silence that followed felt endless. Then came the excuses, not admissions, not accountability, excuses. It wasn't what you think. It happened during a rough time. I was confused. We were having problems. Every sentence somehow managed to place responsibility everywhere except where it belonged. For years I would have argued. For years I would have defended myself. That day I didn't. I simply listened. Eventually she stopped talking. You aren't even going to say anything, I answered quietly. No, that seemed to upset her more than anything else, because anger she could fight. Silence was different. Silence meant the game was over. When the call ended, I sat there for a while thinking about how strange betrayal really is. The affair itself had hurt, but the endless rewriting of history somehow hurt even more. Suddenly, every happy memory becomes disputed territory. Every vacation, every anniversary, every family photo. You start wondering which moments were real and which ones were performances. Fortunately, I didn't have much time to sit with those thoughts. Because the situation involving Travis was turning into something neither of us expected. The next morning, Nolan called. I answered immediately. His first words were simple. Well, Emily didn't take it quietly. I almost laughed. I didn't expect she would, neither had Travis. Apparently, after reviewing the evidence, Emily had done something very few people anticipated. Instead of confronting him privately, she went directly to her father. Now remember, her father wasn't just some retired businessman. The manufacturing company Travis worked for belonged to him. The executive position, the salary, the status, much of Travis's lifestyle existed because of that connection, and according to Nolan, Emily's father took the news personally, very personally. Within 48 hours, an emergency meeting was scheduled. Internal audits began, financial reviews followed, then personnel investigations. At first I assumed they were looking for a reason to fire him. What nobody expected was what they actually found. The affair wasn't the only secret Travis had been keeping. Several questionable business decisions suddenly came under scrutiny. Expense accounts, contract approvals, vendor relationships, nothing criminal from what I was told, but enough poor judgment that his position quickly became impossible to defend. 1 week later he was terminated, just like that. Years of carefully cultivated status vanished in a single afternoon. Then came the house. That part almost felt unreal. The home where Travis and Emily lived had technically been purchased through a family trust established by her parents years earlier, a detail Travis apparently never paid much attention to. When the divorce process began, he discovered something painful. The house wasn't really his. A month later, he was packing boxes. Funny how paperwork can humble people faster than pride ever will. Meanwhile, my own divorce moved forward, much quieter, much less dramatic. The court process wasn't fun. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but compared to what could have happened, it remained surprisingly civil. There were difficult conversations, painful meetings, awkward custody discussions. Still, we managed to avoid turning our children into ammunition, and for that I'll always be grateful. The kids eventually learned that mom and dad weren't staying married. What they didn't learn were the details, at least not from me. Children deserve honesty, they don't deserve adult warfare. One afternoon, several months later, Lauren and I met at a coffee shop to finalize a few remaining details. It was the first time we'd sat across from each other without lawyers involved. For a while, neither of us said much. Then she asked a question, a simple question, one I'd been expecting. When did you know? I stirred my coffee. For a second, I thought about telling her everything, the emails, the mileage, the investigation, the reports. Instead, I smiled faintly. The kids, her eyes widened. The kids, I nodded. They noticed before I did. For the first time during that entire conversation, she looked genuinely ashamed, not because she'd been caught, because she realized who had unknowingly exposed the truth, her own children. Sometimes life has a sense of irony that nobody could write convincingly. After that meeting, our conversations became rare: birthdays, graduations, occasional family logistics, nothing more. As for Travis, well, stories travel, especially in smaller communities. Over the next year, I heard bits and pieces. He moved twice, changed jobs, disappeared from most social circles. Some people said he relocated out west. Others claimed he started over in another state entirely. I honestly don't know. And eventually I stopped caring. That's another thing nobody tells you about revenge. The fantasy is exciting. The reality is different. You spend months imagining some perfect moment where justice arrives and suddenly heals everything. But healing doesn't work that way. Watching someone face consequences doesn't erase betrayal. It doesn't restore trust. It doesn't rewind time. The real victory comes later, quietly, unexpectedly. The first morning you wake up and don't think about it. The first weekend you genuinely laugh again. The first time you realize the anger isn't driving anymore. That's when you know you've won. A couple years have passed now. Ethan is getting ready for college. Abby isn't far behind. Life moved forward whether any of us were ready or not. The house feels different, smaller somehow, quieter but peaceful. And peace is worth more than I ever understood before all this happened. Sometimes people ask whether I regret exposing everything. Whether I should have handled it privately. Whether notifying Emily was going too far. Maybe that's a fair question. I've thought about it myself, a lot actually. Because once the truth came out, it didn't just affect Lauren and Travis. It affected children, parents, friends, entire families. The fallout spread far beyond the people responsible. Then I remember something. Neither Emily nor I created that situation. We didn't create the lies. We didn't create the betrayal. We simply stopped protecting it, and maybe that's where the real debate begins. If you discover a truth that will destroy multiple lives, do you expose it, or do you stay silent and let the lie continue? Honestly, I still don't know if there's a perfect answer. What I do know is this: every person involved got the same thing in the end, the truth. And whatever happened afterward belonged to the choices they had already made long before I ever hired a private investigator. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have done exactly what I did? Would you have sent the evidence to the other spouse? Would you have exposed everything at once? Or would you have handled it differently? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this rarely have simple answers, and sometimes the line between justice and revenge is a lot thinner than people want to admit. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't getting even. It's refusing to protect someone else's lie.